Hello everybody and welcome to another Eye for Travel webinar. This time we are going to be focusing on surviving the GDPR, the unstoppable regulation. So, as many of you probably know, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation is the most significant change in data privacy regulations in 20 years. The new regulation was designed to harmonize data privacy across Europe and empower all EU citizens' data privacy rights. The law is going to reshape the way organizations across Europe approach data privacy. It's also going to have a dramatic effect on the way companies in the rest of the world, and in particular the United States, with European headquarters and European branches approach data. The regulation will be officially enforced on the 25th of May 2018, at which time those organizations in non-compliance will face very heavy fines. So we are happy to be joined on the webinar today by the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of alltherooms.com, William Beckler. And thank you very much for joining us, Bill.
Hello. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you, Bill. Now, unfortunately, just to let everyone know, we couldn't be joined as well by Touristik's Alexander Gartner due to a change of events, but I have every faith that Bill will give us some insight into the new rules. To give you a bit of an insight into William Beckler himself, Bill has a law degree from Columbia University, where he focused on privacy rights, and he also has a background as an engineer. Bill is former head of analytics for lastminute.com, and for the past 4 years he has been the chief technology officer of alltherooms.com, which is an accommodations meta search engine, for those of you that don't know, that interfaces with dozens of accommodation brands. So to give you a very short summary, Beckler will discuss the GDPR's impact on the travel industry, including GDPR rights and consequences, travel industry specific implications, and very importantly, what everybody should be preparing for today. So, Bill, to start with our first question, within the core segment of the GDPR rights and consequences, could we get everyone up to speed with the rights of access, please?
Sure. Before we jump straight in, I'd like to give a little backgrounder. The travel industry is massive and it's global. By definition, travel companies have to deal with a wider range of geographies than similarly sized companies in other verticals. It's a highly competitive vertical. I'm sure everybody who's dialed in on this call who's from the travel industry is nodding their heads right now. It's highly competitive, data-driven, and personalized. We have almost too much data for our own good, and the best companies are the ones that are the best at using data about customers to optimize their offerings. The travel industry is awash in data, and it's also awash in regulations because of its wide footprint. On the other hand, travel companies like IHG this year, Trump Hotels this year, are targets of hackers. The hotel brands are collecting credit cards, and IHG, for example, had someone hack into all their point-of-sale systems in their restaurants and in their front desks and steal credit cards from hundreds of thousands of customers. Trump Hotels had a similar thing on a smaller scale. Earlier this year, around New Year's, the PNR systems of most of the major GDSs were shown to be exposing important customer data for anybody who was able to just guess a PNR. And the industry is heavily exposed. These regulations came at a time when they were needed. There's a lot of political support for them because there's a lot of problems with customer data being exposed and actually harming our customers. Now, the GDPR is an extremely powerful regulation. It's not a directive like what we've seen with previous privacy regulations in Europe, where a directive is passed, like the cookie rule, and then every travel company needed to scramble to follow the laws of every European country separately. Instead, the European Commission itself has passed the specific laws that need to be followed in every EU country. Not only that, the regulations are so broad that they cover every company on the planet that processes information of EU citizens. The UK is an interesting case. They are passing mirror legislation. Even though Brexit is happening, they're going to parrot these regulations, maybe with a couple tweaks here and there, but for all intents and purposes, the UK is part of the EU. That means that the GDPR regulations cover a population of 500 million Europeans. And Europeans are by far the highest traveling sector of the planet. So it's 500 million of the most highly traveling population. It's probably the majority of all travel happening on the planet is covered by GDPR. That means that American companies that are processing data of Europeans or are directly transacting with Europeans are within the jurisdiction of this law, which was not the case in previous European data privacy regulations. For example, there used to be a rule called the Safe Haven rule where European companies could transact with American companies if those American companies followed a much more limited and watered down version of European privacy regulations. The Safe Haven was eventually dismembered and replaced with what's called the Privacy Shield. And any American company that's processing Europeans' data should be part of the Privacy Shield today. Maybe you're not. It's not being heavily enforced. The Privacy Shield and Safe Haven are no longer going to protect American companies from the full force of European regulations. Every company in Europe that's processing EU citizen data and every American company that's processing EU citizen data, even if it's on behalf of a European company and you don't have any footprint in Europe, you are subject to the GDPR. Companies who are subject to the GDPR and who violate the core principles of the GDPR can face fines of 20 million euros or 4% of their annual revenue, whichever is higher. So no one is getting away with a small fine unless it's a small violation. So GDPR is terrifying and it's massive and is coming into effect in May of next year. Now, the first question that Leo asked me is the right of access. Now, GDPR has a broad range of rights that it grants citizens, and it's up to the companies who process data to make sure that all of these rights are fulfilled. The rights against corporate use of people's private data. I'm not going to give a complete overview of every last detail of the GDPR. I'm also not going to go into the philosophy of the GDPR. If you're curious about what is the history of it, what is the philosophy, you'll have to do some research on your own. I want to go into some of the very critical and obvious nuts and bolts ways in which the GDPR has to be acted upon very quickly by travel companies. That's the agenda that I've designed for this webinar. And so it's not going to be complete. It's not a full-fledged GDPR 101. It's the nuts and bolts. What are the areas that you got to keep your eyes on if you want to be in compliance when May comes around? Right of access is one of the most alarming and critical features of the GDPR. The right of access says, and this is a long list of things that it says, the right of access says that everybody who has data in your system has the right to obtain confirmation of whether you have their data and where it is. So if a customer of a hotel wants to know whether that hotel has their name somewhere in a file and the date that they stayed in that hotel has to be able to give them that information. Today, I guarantee there's many hotels that are using CMSs or PMSs or reservation management systems or custom software that does not have that ability to recall data of past customers in a way that makes it possible for someone to tell, for example, where that data is physically located, how long it's going to be stored, the purpose of the data, the kinds of data that is there, and the ability to delete that data, which I'll get to later. So there's now a right for customers to find out from you what data you have. Even if today you don't have the ability to retrieve it, if it exists in your system, you're obligated to be able to tell someone that you have it and where it is. A brand new ability that many software platforms for accommodations providers and travel providers, it's an ability that we're not built with today. So this is brand new work that needs to happen. Data subjects have the right to find out why their data is being processed if it's being handed over to other companies. They have the right to find out what kinds of data is being processed, who is looking at it. So for example, if hotel brand X uses PMS Y, but PMS Y has some other company Z that massages the data, combines it, cleans it up, does revenue optimization by combining things with other factors known about those people. All of those processes need to be understood by the brand that is dealing directly with the customer and able to be communicated to that customer. Customers also have a right to know that they have these rights. So it's our duty as travel suppliers and as intermediaries or online travel agencies or anyone who's working directly with a customer to inform them of the existence of these rights, the existence of the right to obtain this information, the existence of the right to erase it, the existence of the right to fix it if there's something wrong, and the restrictions that I'm going to explain about how the data is handled, and also the existence of the right to complain to data protection authorities. There's two kinds of companies that are covered under these regulations. One category, this is a definition that you'll need to keep in mind in order to understand everything I'm explaining, is controller. A data controller is someone who directly interfaces with a private citizen and handles their data. A data processor is someone who processes the data but doesn't directly interact with that person. They work on behalf of a controller. So for example, United Airlines is a data controller, whereas Sabre would be a data processor, unless that individual is able to directly access a Sabre system. And then in that case, there's two controllers, Sabre and the airline. Okay. Data subjects have the right to obtain and change data. That's the end of the right to access.
Okay, interesting. And I can certainly see how this is really bringing on an empowerment of the European citizen and their ownership of the data bill. That's certainly something that's from the onset very clear about the implications of the new rules.
Yeah, it's massive. It's a massive obligation on the part of travel companies, especially travel companies that didn't actually have a hand in building the systems that today don't have the ability to do these things yet.
Interesting, very interesting stuff. I'll move on to the second question. So if you could also tell us about the right to rectify and erase in a little more detail.
Yes.
That would be useful.
So every customer has the right to request that their data is erased. That request can be refused in certain circumstances. For example, if you're a supplier who has a reservation coming up, you need to be able to find out who is coming to your hotel. If someone wants that data erased, you can say, no, I need that data in my system because I have a purpose for having that data. That is the original purpose that I collected it for, and I still need it. There's also other lawful purposes. For example, airlines and companies that sell airplane tickets that are not airlines have an obligation to store PNR data. There's actually a separate regulation that recently was passed that's still in the directive phase. It hasn't been implemented in every EU country, so it's not a law. It's not as powerful. But it's it's going to impact anyone who's dealing with air travel in the EU. and it obligates companies to retain data. In cases where there's laws that obligate a country, that obligate a company, you don't actually have to, the GDPR doesn't undo those other laws. So the GDPR works around other legal obligations, other rights. For example, if an authority requires you to send data to the United States for their PNR requirements, that the GDPR doesn't override that. The GDPR has less priority than that. So there's a right to rectify and erase, but there's an exception to that for data that you have an obligation to store, even if the obligation is simply a contractual obligation or if it's core to delivering the product. That's the right to rectify and erase.
Fantastic, fantastic. And just so the audience knows, as we're going along, feel free to ask questions in the questions box. We will be covering them in the last 5 minutes of the webinar. So we'll try to answer as many questions as possible about the new regulation. Feel free to ask away. So, Bill, to move on to the next question, could you tell us a bit about the implications of the rules on data portability, please?
Absolutely. So this is another massive technical challenge. Most hospitality systems are notorious for being incapable of releasing information and making it easily exportable or interchangeable with other systems. However, GDPR explicitly requires companies to let customers move their data into other systems in a format that's as easy as possible for them to use for that purpose. So, for example, and the details of how this will play out haven't been fully defined, but if a customer is someone who is using, say, VRBO or HomeAway to rent out an apartment, and they've loaded up lots of pictures and personal information about the host, and then they want to take that data and load it into Airbnb or some other platform, that information is never handed out by the likes of VRBO for that purpose. VRBO would be horrified by the idea that you could push a button, get a file that was a format that's easily adaptable by Airbnb to load that same listing into a competing platform. Crazily enough, data portability requires that. Everyone whose private data is stored in a company's system has a right to receive a copy of that personal data in a commonly used machine-readable format so that they can transfer it from one company to another. It's a completely brand new kind of regulation or even concept. It was designed with the idea that people might want to leave Facebook and move to a competing network, and it was to sort of cut in on the monopolies that cloud-based social networks have, but the wording of it is not limited to those platforms, and the wording of it can easily be applied to some travel scenarios where companies have data about customers that they could be asked to put into a transportable format. Another example would be maybe a travel company that has a large amount of personalized information to help ease booking. And in that scenario, a customer should be able to get all of that data out and hand it to a competing company who would not have to go through all the same effort to get that data. That's data portability.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you for that, Bill. And the final question on the rights and consequences. Could you tell us a little bit more about profiling on the customer and, importantly, the right to object?
Yes. So profiling is something that everybody's always worried about. You know, am I getting the same price? Am I getting the same product? Am I getting the same treatment as other people? Or maybe someone has found something out about me. Maybe my IP address is a low-income community and I'm not considered to be a valuable customer. If companies are using data that is about an individual in order to modify the behavior of their systems, so they're sort of processing data and then making a judgment and then modifying their systems in order to give you a customized experience, you can object to that. Now, a company can ask for consent to profile, and they can require profiling if that profiling makes sense for the delivery of a product. So for example, if you want to make sure that only people who've stayed at your hotel 10 times are able to get access to a special deal, that's a valid kind of reason to profile someone. And someone could object, but you can say, listen, this is part of our product. And if you want to use our product, you have to allow us to profile. That conversation is something that needs to be explicitly consented or written into a contract. And it's an important question as to whether people are actually consenting to profiling. And if you need to profile, you have to make sure that it's part of your obligation. So for example, if you're an intermediary and you are selling a product, the intermediary has typically contractual obligations about how they sell that product. So for example, lastminute.com sells a hotel and they're obligated not to say who the hotel is if it's a secret hotel. In that scenario, there could be a class of customers who is allowed to see the hotels. A better example would be, say, Booking.com's secret hotel system. They require someone to be logged in before they show certain prices. The hoteliers are contractually obligating Booking.com to not show those prices. So in that scenario, Booking.com has a contractual obligation that forces them to profile, and that contractual obligation is sufficient reason to profile, and it can't be objected to by a customer. But you have to make sure that your contracts have that in the contract, because the day will come when someone asks you, where is the contract that allows you to profile? And therefore, if you're using profiling as part of a business obligation, you need to make sure it's now explicitly in your contracts. The right to object is therefore able to be impeded by contracts, and so you can really just kind of carve around some critical travel-related deals by putting things into a contractual form. But if you don't take that step, you're in violation of the right to object.
Okay, and obviously that would bring with it some pretty business crippling fines then.
Exactly.
Interesting stuff. Very interesting to hear about some of these finer details behind the new regulation bill. I'm actually going to take a couple of questions from the audience because we have, although at an early stage in the webinar, quite a few pouring in here. So for the first question, someone's actually asked as a question about the type of data that the GDPR applies to. So this person has asked, what is the lowest level of data that has to comply? Is it name, IP address, market segment, price paid? Perhaps you could give us a bit of an insight on that, Bill.
Sure. So step one as to whether anything matters to GDPR is whether there exists something that can be used to identify an individual. And a name obviously can be used for identifying an individual. So can an address or a phone number or a credit card number. Any of these fields by themselves is enough. IP address is something that has been debated in the past, and it turns out that it's been explicitly enumerated as a field that counts. So if you have a system that's recording IP addresses and that information is combined with other data about a person, that's considered to be private information at that point. Once you add other data to that data, you now have the full set of private data. So you're identifying someone and then you're saying anything else about them, you now have private data that needs to be protected. Nobody wants someone to know that they stayed in a hotel if that person shouldn't know that. Even if it's just a name and a date, that's private information. Now, some of these regulations require higher levels of attention and security depending on the sensitivity of the data. So for example, if you have credit card information along with names, that data is expected to be handled in a much more sensitive fashion than if it's just a room number and a date of someone staying in a hotel. But if you have a room number and a date of someone staying in a hotel, and you have information that that person maybe ordered something that tells you something about the health of that customer, that tells you about something about their habits or their preferences, you are talking about what's considered to be sensitive personal information. And It could be that a regulator sees that as maybe even on the level of credit card data if they feel like that it's something that customers really expect to be to remain private. Now, that expectation is not literally defined in the regulation. There's wiggle room for interpretation of the regulation. And as time goes by and as violations appear, there will be panels that will decide where are these lines to be drawn. But for now, it's already been enumerated what constitutes personally identifiable information. And that includes IP address, name, phone number, address, things like that, email address.
Excellent, excellent. That's very, very good to know. I'm actually going to ask a question now that's been posed by a lot of people here. Everyone wants to know, Bill, a bit more about, does the GDPR apply retroactively? What about old and current data? Is there, some kind of grandfather clause that protects that, or is it literally a complete overhaul of all data in people's pockets?
Unfortunately, it's a complete overhaul. If it's old data, you need to either erase it or get it into compliance. There's no grandfathering.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's good to know. Okay, I think I'll select one more question from the audience, and then we'll get back onto our agenda here. How does the GDPR affect companies who wish to centralize data management for the purpose of e-marketing?
That's a good question. A lot of the things that we do that we've done with e-marketing in the past, things like basket abandonment emails, for example, or Facebook retargeting based on individual profiles that have been linked to cookies of people who are interacting with a website. A lot of these uses will now need to be explicitly stated. By explicitly stated, it means that someone has to take an active step to opt in to that kind of interaction. So when you collect an email address for which you're going to do something like that, where your information is going to be used for something that is not directly related to the transaction, you need to be collecting permission for that makes it very clear what you're doing, and that requires an active consent by the customer, almost like the kind of consent that you see on on sites that comply with the cookie ruling, where there's a tick box that explains exactly what they're agreeing to. When it comes to centralized data, there's also the question of where physically is that data located and what is the organization that holds that database. So for example, you might be using an external company like Eloqua to hold all of that information. There needs to be essentially a chain of custody and a complete transparency about where that data is going, and all of the rights that have been mentioned have to be enforced all the way to the endpoint. So company X interacts with an EU citizen, puts that data into a centralized platform that maybe is handled by a third-party company. That third-party company is a data processor, not a controller. That company has to be able to comply with every single one of the rights that the controller is obligated to comply with. And there's no exceptions by virtue of that company being, say, an American company. If the EU citizen's data exists in that other company system, they're obligated, and so is the company that collects the data.
Interesting. So that's good to note for all those listening, that there is no escaping. This is not a regulation that is limited at all by the borders drawn in our different lands. So fantastic. Thank you very much for answering those questions from the audience, Bill. We are actually going to move on to some of the bread and butter consequences of the GDPR, in particular the bread and butter obligations. So for the people, just to get people up to speed on the role of the data protection officer, could you tell the audience a little bit about that, please, Bill?
So the things I've been talking about so far, there's a lot of ways to implement them, and they are very specific regulations. There's another layer to the GDPR, which I think is very smart, and that's a layer that asks companies to think about security not as a bunch of tick boxes, but as a philosophy. It's something that there needs to be an advocate for the customer's privacy above and beyond the other interests of the company. And in order for that process to happen, there needs to be someone who's somewhat independent, yet still capable of enacting security policies and technologies within a company at the executive level. That means that companies are required to hire someone to do that, and that person is the data protection officer, a high-ranking official who has the power to track, monitor, and influence the technology and business practices in order to advocate for the customer, for the customer's privacy, and that person is able to overrule the teams who would otherwise be needing or wanting to cut corners on that. For example, they cannot be reporting into the CMO or the CTO. They have to be reporting up through a separate hierarchy that does not have an interest in infringing on customers' privacy. The data protection officer is expected to be a full-time in-house position in a company. However, it's possible that it's not full-time if the data responsibilities are not enough to merit a full-time job. So if it's not a large company, you could maybe have it as a part-time obligation. There's also the option of hiring an outside person to do that. You can hire a lawyer, you can hire some kind of agency that specializes in DPO services, and there's probably going to be an infinitude of models of how companies are going to figure out how to do DPO, their DPO application, without having to hire a full-time person to do it. But that remains to be seen how that plays out.
Interesting. So it's good to know, everybody, that the role of the DPO doesn't leave any room for distortion of the findings, and it will always lie with a neutral party. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Ideally, yes. One would hope. So we are going to move on to the next question in terms of these bread and butter obligations. If you could tell us a bit about the data protection impact assessment, please, Bill.
Sure, absolutely. Now, this is similar to the DPO in that it's a process and more philosophical regulation that's aimed at actual security rather than just ticking boxes. Companies are being asked to really think about how new projects, how data-related projects are going to impact customer privacy and data, and the security of data. So when you are proposing a change within a company, you are expected to always do a data protection impact assessment. And this is something that is going to become top of mind for every company, and we're going to start getting haunted by DPIAs in our sleep, because it's something that's going to come up throughout the entire process of getting into compliance. And my recommendation is that companies start practicing DPIAs today, because you're about to go through a large set of changes to come into compliance if you haven't already, and most companies I've spoken with have not. And so it's a good time to practice this and get sort of the machine of DPIA production rolling so that it doesn't ambush you when May comes around.
Interesting. Thank you for that, Bill. And could you talk us through the breach notification process, please?
Sure. When companies are hacked, it's always very embarrassing. Nobody wants to tell people. It's potentially inviting lawsuits from customers whose data might have been stolen. Well, it's been decided that nobody is allowed to keep a hack under wraps. If you have any reason to believe that there's been a data breach, whether it's an internal data breach, an external data breach, an accidental release of information on the internet, maybe a tree falling in the woods that nobody saw, but if it was a breach, it needs to be reported to a local officer in one of the member states, and every company needs to select who the officer is. I'll talk about that later. And the data processor or the controller If it's a data processor like a local or an email system, they need to notify the controller who's contracting with them. And if it's a controller, they need to contact a customer if a customer has been affected by the breach. Breach notification needs to happen within 72 hours of people becoming aware of the breach, which means that there is not very much time to figure out what happened, who saw what, where it all went. This kind of thing needs to be figured out quickly. And that means that everybody needs to be ready to sort of do forensics on a breach when a breach happens in a very short time period.
Yep.
And you also
Certainly
need to be able, you need to know which officer you'll report it to in advance. And I'll talk about that as well.
Right. Well, it certainly gives a short time period, a very strict expectation in terms of turnaround. And in terms of the lawful basis and types of consent, maybe you could tell us a little bit before that, before we move on to the travel implications of the GDPR bill.
So consent can be gained for some types of data processing at different levels. One type of consent is called explicit consent. It's something that looks like what the cookie legislation required, where websites actually had to make you stop and do something before they stopped bugging you about something that they were doing. That's explicit consent. There are some aspects of data processing that require not necessarily explicit consent, but unambiguous consent. So a pre-checked checkbox that tells you clearly what's going to happen with your data. These two types of consent are designed to limit what companies can do with data. So if you collect data today for one purpose and you want to use it for a different purpose, if you don't have unambiguous consent to make that change, you can't do it. And for some of the more sensitive things that you might want to do with data, you need to get explicit consent. Those two types of consents are things that your design teams, your legal teams, and everybody who knows where you're collecting data needs to understand as you go through and evaluate what your obligation is for each type of data. Now, the grid of what kinds of data require which type of consent and what activities require those, I'm not going to get into, but it's something that you're going to have to sort of bone up on and be ready to apply when the time comes and you're designing your systems. There are also contractual and lawful bases for collecting data, and that is another thing that you'll need to understand before you decide what your data strategy is. Where is it that you're allowed to collect data because you're obligated to under contracts, and where is it that you have to collect data because you're obligated to under other laws, like, for example, the PNR regulations that are coming out at the same time.
Interesting. Very interesting. Now, before we move on to the travel implications, this travel industry-specific impacts of the regulation, we're going to bounce back to the audience and just take a couple of questions before we move on. So to start with, someone is asking, who is liable for the data compliance? Is it the data owner, the data provider of the data system, or the owner themselves of the data system?
That's a really good question. It turns out that the liability has been designed in an extremely severe fashion. Everybody is liable. By that I mean the data controller, the entity that collects the data directly from a customer, they are fully liable for any faults that happen along the line of data ownership. Now, in some cases, there are multiple controllers, and this is especially true in travel transactions. So, for example, if you use Booking.com to make a reservation at Hilton, that information is collected by Booking.com and immediately handed to Hilton, and you're in a direct relationship with Hilton. You have Hilton's phone number, you can call them, they have your personal data, which you know they have, and therefore both Booking.com and Hilton are a data controller in that scenario. If the data is lost in transit or breached in transit or used in an improper fashion as part of that transaction, both Booking.com and Hilton are completely liable for what happens. Now, there is a rule that says that in a case where there's more than one company that's liable, if you can prove that you have done every single thing you needed to do and you're in compliance, the liability is able to be shifted onto the other entity that couldn't, or whoever messed up ends up having to pay. But at the beginning, everybody is fully liable, and the burden of proof and the obligations and the exposure to fines or reimbursement to customers is on the shoulders of everybody involved in a transaction or involved in handling the data. It's an extremely kind of broad liability structure.
Interesting. Oh, okay. That answers a couple of people's questions right there, Bill. Brilliant. There's a question that's also come in. Does a small independent hotel need a DPO as well?
So that's a good question. There's not an explicit number of records that defines when a DPO is needed, but if you are under the GDPR, you need to have some concept of a person, a physical person on this planet who has the last say on privacy. Now, so the question is not, do you need a DPO? The question is, do you need to hire someone for that? Or could it be someone in the organization who's doing other things? Could it be the executive assistant to the CEO? Could it be the hotel manager? Could it be someone else it's not their full-time gig? And the answer is absolutely yes. If the amount of data you have does not merit the amount of effort that a full-time position would give you, then you can economize. You can also hire an outside firm to do it on a limited basis. Maybe one person is handling DPO obligations for 100 hotels, if it's a very easy to sort of economize type of responsibility. So far, the rules and practices of the DPO structure haven't been defined, but the overall purposes of it are laid out in a way that lets companies start to figure out what is reasonable.
Excellent. That's very good to know. Brilliant. Okay, Bill. So I'm going to move back to our main agenda now. So what we're going to look at is the travel-specific implications. Most people who are listening in, tuning in today, are from travel backgrounds. So to start with, could you tell us a bit about profiling for revenue optimization or opacity, including regional pricing groups?
Absolutely. So when, for example, a hotel is loading prices into a meta search system like Trivago or TripAdvisor or Google Hotel Price Ads, that hotel has the option of saying that people in North America can get price 1 and people in Europe can get price 2, or people in Germany can get price 1 and people in France can get price 2. There's also the option in some platforms to say people who are physically located within 2 miles of the hotel get price 1 and people who are not within that circle get price 2. Those distinctions, location-based distinctions, are private information. They're personal information. And that personal information is being used to profile people, and the system is acting upon that profile to give different pricing. That is the kind of activity that needs to be made explicit to customers, and they need to either consent to it or be informed of it. And the distinction whether it's something that can be unambiguously informing or whether it's explicit, that needs to be looked into. So I don't know whether it's one or the other. But the point is the activities today that are considered to be normal practices will no longer be allowed without having to also give people the tools to undo those things or to be forced to consent to them because of contractual reasons. Another great example of that would be loyalty programs that hinge offers based on information that are stored about people. Those kinds of distinctions, like something that segments customers into great customers or terrible customers, those kinds of distinctions are now the kinds of things that you're obligated to share with your customers. You cannot hide information that you've calculated about a customer from your own customers, especially if you're using that information to decide what offers to show a customer. Another great example of that would be a front desk optimization system like NOR1. NOR1 is taking the data that a hotel has about a customer and deciding what type of upsell to give someone at the front desk or over the phone. And that information that is stored and the way it's being used by NOR1 is something that a customer now has the right to see and to object to if it's not necessary for the way the business is running. And I would say that in most cases it will be considered to be an unnecessary thing in order to sell a hotel room. So there are a lot of travel industry practices that involve segmenting people that are going to be able to be peeled apart based on the way that the rights are defined within the GDPR. And some people might even have to completely change their business model for how they optimize revenue across classes of customers.
Interesting. Okay then, yeah, and it's interesting you covered there. The segmentation part obviously is just such an issue that's so salient in the travel industry right now. Maybe we could also talk now a bit about cross-border impacts of transactions, and this is an important point as well for people who are doing business who are not based in the European Union but have customers directly sourced from the European Union. So could you tell us a little bit about that, please, Bill?
Absolutely. So traditionally, cross-border information flows and cross-border transactions were covered under things like the Safe Harbor Agreement, and most companies were not obligated to follow all of the regulations of the home countries of the people whose data they were processing. Nowadays, that's completely changed. The obligations towards European citizens flow with that person's data into any system that that data flows into. That means that a company that is handling data and doing deals with multiple other companies, which is really how all travel happens almost by definition, that kind of information flow needs to be accompanied by a chain of contracts that confirm that the rights will also flow with that data. And today, by default, contracts do not contain those obligations. So practically every single contract that exists, in order for a company to remain compliant, practically every single contract that exists will need to be modified to include the flow of rights that goes along with the flow of data. If data is transferred to a third party, the contract with that third party has to require that the rights also flow with that data. The other point around cross-border implications of transactions has to do with how all parties are obligated for all damages for a breach. The non-responsible party can recover from those responsible. So if the controller of data, if Hilton, for example, is sued by someone because they are financially obligated to pay for the damages caused by a breach, but the breach was caused by a system that they're using, they're allowed to recover from the system that they were using. And that's how it will work. So you don't have to figure out who breached your data. You only have to sue your data controller.
I see. Okay then. And in terms of notification complexities, what are some of the implications there for the wider travel industry, Bill?
Well, a lot of the rules around GDPR have to do with making sure that customers know they have these rights and that they know when their data is being used for certain purposes. The challenge is that travel transactions can involve a dozen different companies sometimes. You use a meta search engine to get to Booking.com, who does a deal with a hotel, but it turns out that the deal with the hotel is going through an intermediary who was doing the distribution of that into Booking.com for that hotel. And your information could pass through 4 or 5 systems before your reservation ends up in someone's database. All of these companies might need to be gathering consent for what they're doing with that data. How do you communicate how data has been used if traditionally this type of thing was never kept track of? There's a new kind of process that's going to be necessary for any kind of data usage that flows through multiple parties. And the process is a two-directional process. So for example, if the end of the chain needs to do something to a piece of data or needs to delete a piece of data, the communication about that data needs to be able to flow along with the data itself. So while today I can push through a record that goes through 4 different companies and ends up in a database in a hotel system, tomorrow I may need to be able to push through a request to delete that record, something that's unheard of in the protocols that all 4 of those companies have to deal with today. But they will need to be able to transmit a request to delete that data all the way through to the endpoint. And that deletion request also comes with all kinds of other requests, like tell me what you've got, where is it stored? I need to be able to correct that data. I need to know how it's being used to profile. I need to be able to delete it. Those kinds of things flow with the data in a way that today has never been touched. So when it comes to notifications and when it comes to contracts for any distribution agreement that involves private customer information, a whole new way of thinking about how that data flows and what kinds of rights and responsibilities flow with that data has to be incorporated both into the contracts and into the physical systems that are implemented by those contracts or as a result of those contracts.
Very good. That's interesting to know there how far the law actually does reach in terms of the contractual side. And also in terms of travel industry implications, we're going to move on to customer or traveler retaliation. So how would a traveler go about invoking their rights if they were disgruntled with the use of their data bill?
So this is something that is really kind of hypothetical, but I think it's important because travel industry is always hit hard with things like advertising standards and other types of business practice enforcement. We get the brunt of it. And I think the reason for that is because the travel industry is a bit of a cutthroat industry. If there's a way for one company to undermine another company, you'll see it happen. I mean, the monopoly laws, the contract laws have been pushed to their limits by litigation between companies like Expedia and Ryanair, or localities in Expedia. And travel companies, and especially suppliers, often find that there are customers that they simply cannot make happy because of the nature of the travel business. Some people will be unhappy. And sometimes people are so disgruntled that they make a profession of seeking out revenge on travel companies. Now, everybody's got thick skin. Everybody's used to that. Travel industry is used to people. Not everyone's always happy. That's fine. But with the rise of GDPR, there's another dynamic here, which is that anybody who has a bone to pick with any company, whether it's a customer or a competitor, if anyone has a bone to pick, there's a very delicate bone called GDPR obligations that could potentially lead to fines in the millions if a company is found to be out of compliance. Now, there have been privacy regulations in the past that have just sort of been floating around. Individuals are not really in a position to pursue remedies around that. But all of the sort of customer rights and notification features of GDPR empower customers more than ever to take it upon themselves to make sure that companies are punished or regulated if they believe that their data isn't being handled properly. And this means that if you are out of compliance, I believe that the dynamics of the travel industry, the cutthroat nature of it, means that the risk is far greater under GDPR than it was under previous systems. If you're out of compliance for PCI, no big deal. You may have to change it. Who's going to complain? Very few people will. Previous data protection regulations, there were very few ways that people even knew about what you were obligated to do. Nobody could ever really kind of force a company to turn over all their data and then pick on them if there's a little bit missing. Nowadays, there's going to be a fine-tooth comb around every single piece of this for companies that are heavily exposed. So if you have a lot of customers, some of whom are disgruntled, the risk of non-compliance is massive.
I see. That leaves a very wide door open there for being in violation of the law, and it really is something that people need to be working on now, obviously, to get right. So with that in mind, and the fact that people will be having to go through their data stores with a fine-tooth comb, how do you see the voice of the travel industry reacting to this new stringent regulation?
This is something that I was really looking forward to bringing up, because right now we have over 200 people on the call presently, and several hundred more people that are likely to see this call. And this is something that I would like to invite everybody who's on this call to be thinking about, which is the GDPR rules are designed to interface with bodies that represent the interests of each vertical that is affected by the GDPR. And some of the things I've been bringing up, for example, the way that data privacy rights flow with the data through multiple systems, is a complexity that's probably somewhat unique to the travel industry itself, and it could be extremely burdensome for anybody to deal with it. And maybe the rules need to be interpreted in a way that doesn't require massive changes to every single physical system that data flows through. It could be a way to think about this that doesn't invoke so many obligations. There's also questions about what kinds of entities need to have a full-time DPO. That is an industry-specific question, because hotel data has very different dynamics in terms of whether it's interesting to hackers compared to medical data or banking data or retail data from non-travel companies. Each vertical has its own interests, its own practices, its own traditions, its own challenges, and its own ways of thinking about the importance and sensitivity of data. The travel industry is expected to come up with its own answers to that question, but right now, today, there is nobody actually, as far as I know, and I could very well be wrong about that, there's a gap. There's nobody in the travel industry that is the voice of the travel industry with respect to what is the kind of missing pieces in terms of the GDPR regulations that need to be filled in. IATA is not really answering this in a clear way. GBTA is not answering it in a clear way. Several entities are not answering it in a clear way. And this forum that we're having today is one of the first kind of conversations that digs into the GDPR implications specifically for travel. And anybody on the call today who is potentially in a leadership position in a travel body may think about how you can start to organize the voice of the travel industry so we can talk back to the GDPR in a way that helps us all have more clarity about what we should be doing for some of the more open questions, where we don't want to have to make a judgment call about whether we need a full-time DPO, for example.
You're absolutely right. There certainly is a need for cross-industry clarity, from the smallest independent motels to the Hiltons and the Accors of this world, and also from the airlines and the car hires and such. And seeing as we're talking about the voice of the travel industry, I think this is a good opportunity just to bring in our events. So i4Travel will be running two data-specific summits for both the European market and the North American market. So we'll be running our Smart Travel Data Summit on the 29th to the 30th of November 2017 in Amsterdam. And that's also going to be running alongside our Digital Strategies for Travel Summit, which will be right down the hall. And then in February, we will be running the American or North American counterpart, the Smart Travel Data Summit North America, which will be taking place on the 27th to the 28th of February in Miami. And both of these events will be having a specific focus on the implications of the GDPR and really come back to all these issues that we're talking about and getting sort of a collective movement across the industry together to really tackle the regulation and make it work in our favor. So those are two events there for your diary if the GDPR affects you. So we are going to move on to our last set of questions now before wrapping up. Now, really, if you go onto the European Commission website, you'll see they've actually got a countdown timer for the enforcement of the new regulation. And really, we need to be talking about what we need to prepare for today as the regulations being enforced in a mere 9 months. Bill, what key questions should people be asking now?
Yes, great question. So first, ask yourself, what data can you just chuck out of your system today? Delete old records, delete stuff that you don't need anymore, delete fields that you don't use, Do you really need mother's maiden name? Do you really need emergency contact number if you don't use it? Can you delete it if a trip has already happened, for example, because you only need it before a trip, not after? Whatever you can delete, start deleting and start setting up processes that delete stuff. There's no need to have extra data because with data comes obligations that you don't want. The more you can delete now, the less you have to think about as you design your data protection strategy. Next, pick where your lead data protection supervisory authority will be located. Every company needs to pick one EU country where they will have a representative who is in direct contact with the authority of that country. That person is actually under the jurisdiction of that authority and could actually be fined personally or arrested if it's merited due to breaches or violations. So you have to choose carefully what jurisdiction and what individual will be in contact with that authority, and you need to pick that quickly so that you can make sure that the rest of your strategy flows. For example, the language that you use for expressing consent and other things within the regulations is dependent on which country you pick. This is especially important if you're multi-country or non-EU. Non-EU companies need to have an EU-based representative physically located in the EU. It doesn't have to be a full-time person, but you need to figure out who is an individual that you can say is in direct contact with a data protection supervisor in the country that they're physically in. Then you need to start assembling your team and educate yourself. That's kind of step one. And I hope everybody's on this seminar is thinking that there's a lot more that you need to know. I can't possibly cover it all in this seminar. And everybody really who's working on this needs to be a student of the regulations. There's no way that you can really make a dent without really trying to bone up on the principles and understanding this. A lot of people in your company are going to need to understand this.
Okay, so there's no ambiguity there. Everyone needs to be absolutely clued up on what they need to do and what the implications will be. What kind of tools are people going to need, Bill, to be fully GDPR ready when it comes into effect in May of next year?
So in terms of tools, there's a massive ecosystem that has already sprung up around how to protect data. One really great kind of tool is a compliance support framework. I'm not going to name individual vendors for that, but there are companies that list out every obligation based on a sort of like a survey of who you are and what you're doing and how your systems are set up, and then they give you checkboxes of what to do and when, and they help you manage your compliance. That's useful if you have a complex organization, but if you don't, it could actually be more work than necessary. So you have to make a judgment call as to whether you need a compliance support framework. Next is companies that have never considered this in the past are going to now need to start considering this, which is hiring someone to penetrate your own security systems to make sure that your company is not exposed to hackers. You may have never had to think about this in the past, but you don't want a hacker to be the one who figures out that your data is able to be breached. You want to be the one to figure it out yourself. And to that end, you need to hire a company that hires hackers that do an ethical penetration of your own systems and give you a report of what needs to be fixed so that your systems are not easy for a hacker to hack. So what you want in terms of systems there and tools is maybe an automated penetration testing framework or a company that does that kind of penetration testing. Next, when it comes to breach response, the 72-hour window is an extremely tight window. There are tool vendors who have what are called incident management tools, and those, for many companies that have very sensitive data, are almost certainly going to want to have an incident management tool so that you can compile information quickly and figure out who to notify, what is the chain of command, what are the processes when the breach happens, and you don't want to have to be figuring out who is who after 72 hours have already passed and find yourself out of compliance with GDPR at a very delicate situation where you already have a breach and all eyes are going to be on you once you do report it. And then lastly, there's a set of tools that are called forensic tools for systematically analyzing breaches after they happen to figure out who saw what data and what is the trail of access of things And those kinds of tools, most travel companies have never had to worry about that. If something was breached, well, you close the breach and you just think, I hope that doesn't happen again. But you don't spend time figuring out exactly which records happened, what was the exact method that was used. That kind of information now needs to be figured out very quickly in order for you to be in compliance.
Excellent, fantastic to know some of the bread and butter tools there that are in need to really make this a success. Now, before we wrap up, just one more question, Bill. This is, probably something that's on everybody's minds. As humans, a lot of us naturally want to take the path of least resistance. So, how much effort is it really going to require for travel companies, or for any companies, to be GDPR prepared?
So, unfortunately, there's no good news here. I've been thinking about what is the path of least resistance, and unfortunately, the path of least resistance is a very arduous path. You need a team working on this that includes both technical people and experts in your marketing systems, and people who understand your business strategy, and people who have a legal understanding, because some of the interpretations of GDPR regulations are complicated. That's 4 different types of skills that need to be combined into a single team for you to truly succeed in complying. Next, almost any company that exists will have to work with at least some vendors. It could be specialized security vendors. It could be legal experts who understand compliance. There will be vendors involved. I'm not going to list vendors. I don't think that's my place. But you're going to be probably bringing in outside help because it's not very much time and there's a lot of work that people need to do. There also could be a need for technical vendors. So for example, systems that have never been touched in years, you might have to just hire a contract programmer for 2 months to add a feature that allows you to delete or move data as per the regulations. Almost every contract in existence in your company is likely to be touched by GDPR, sadly. And that means that one of the most expensive people in the company, the lawyer, is going to have a field day. No coincidence that lawyers had a lot to do with drafting the GDPR. So you would expect that lawyers are going to get some kind of benefit out of it, and every contract in existence for most companies are going to have to be looked at to decide what are the GDPR implications for that contract. There's going to need to be changes to how employees are dealt with, trainings, internal policies that are instituted that are well beyond what's being done today. All privacy policies and disclaimers on websites are going to need to be looked at and modified so that the right kind of consent is included. All website flows that today are designed to collect consent or collect information will need to be examined and modified. So that involves both design, front-end developers, and in some cases, back-end developers. The database architecture is going to need to be looked at and possibly modified. And in many companies, a new position or even multiple positions in the company will need to be created. I can't think of a shortcut on any of these pieces. Maybe other people will figure out a way to get by with less effort. But for any company that is doing a significant amount of business, each of the areas I just mentioned, a team that has all 4 of those pillars, vendors, contracts, employees, privacy policies and disclaimers, website flows, database architecture, and new positions. All of those are going to have to happen.
Interesting. So the conclusion to that really is that shortcuts are not going to be good enough for properly implementing the GDPR. Skill sets, in-house training, the use of the use of vendors that isn't in-house, and the employment of robust lawyers is really the recipe for successfully implementing this within the company structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless you want to play Russian roulette with a 10 or 20 million euro fine, you're going to have to do all of these things.
Brilliant. Well, we'll end on that note then, Bill. Well, I want to say a big thank you for all the insight and information that you've shared with us about the implications of the GDPR and how to prepare for it. It's certainly been very eye-opening. And I also want to thank all of the registrants for this webinar. Thank you very much for listening in. And yes, thank you very much, Bill. A very good day to you.
I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to answer more questions. So if you have questions, I'm not too hard to find on LinkedIn or Twitter. And I'm happy to answer further questions that you can think of. And also, hopefully, I can see some of you guys at one or both of the i4Travel events where we can discuss this in person.
Absolutely, that sounds like a good plan. Thanks again, Bill. Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.
Goodbye, everyone.